At 3 a.m., the billionaire expected dust. He found a maid diagramming open-heart surgery. The library of the mansion by the Charles River was mostly ornamental. Mahogany shelves, rare leather-bound volumes of medical texts, antique brass reading lamps. By day, it showcased the intellectual past of a man who had walked away from academia. But that night, at 3 a.m., a light was still on, breaking the darkness. Julian Beckett, former Harvard professor and now biotech billionaire, awoke to the faint rustling of paper. He had a light sleeper's curse. Anything louder than a pencil falling could wake him. "Who in the house is still walking at this hour?" Throwing on his wool robe, he walked down the hall toward the library. The door was slightly ajar, light slipping under. Inside, in the middle of the room, a young woman knelt on the floor. Around her lay a constellation of aged medical books, scraps of paper, and handwritten lecture notes, ones Julian himself had once taught from. She was drawing a human heart on a torn shipping wrapper, beside it a careful note. Bentall procedure, replacement of ascending aorta and aortic valve with composite graft. Julian stopped in his tracks. He recognized the girl, Maria, 19, the daughter of a Mexican laborer who died in a traffic accident last year. She had dropped out of school in 11th grade to support her younger brother, who had congenital heart disease. Though officially a maid, she had quietly asked for permission to stay late and read in the silence. Julian spoke, voice low. "What are you doing with that?" Maria startled. She stood, unsure where to place her hands. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just—" "Do you understand what you wrote?" Maria hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. It's the Bentall procedure. When the ascending aorta dilates past 5.5 centimeters, rupture risk increases. The patient needs urgent replacement, usually with a Dacron graft. But I'm confused why they don't use EPTFE for younger patients." Julian didn't answer. He stepped forward, picked up the paper, and studied it. Though her understanding was still rudimentary, Maria had labeled each structure with startling precision. Her heart diagram was anatomically sound, each valve and chamber correctly identified. "Who taught you this?" "No one. I found books. I copy things down." "Why are you studying?" Maria's voice lowered. "To help my brother. The doctor said he needs a transplant, but the wait list is too long. I thought, if I understood the heart better, maybe I could—" Her voice broke. Julian said nothing, eyes fixed on her notes. This girl, the one who scrubbed the floors beneath his feet, was reaching into a level of knowledge most third-year medical students hadn't mastered. Above them, the chandelier swayed slightly. Outside, the sky was still dark. Julian finally said, "Tomorrow you won't be cleaning. You'll sit with me. Every evening. We'll start from the beginning." Maria blinked. "You—" Julian Beckett didn't smile. "You were right. Dacron releases fewer free radicals than EPTFE, especially in pediatric patients. Do you know why?" Maria shook her head. Julian pulled out a chair. "Sit. I'll teach you." In the hush of that late hour, in a dusty corner of a forgotten library, a class of 2 quietly began. One a former professor, one a janitor, and between them, a mountain of unopened books, waiting to be read. The next evening, the library no longer felt like a museum. Julian Beckett arrived promptly at 7 p.m., arms full of old binders, flashcards, and a freshly printed syllabus. He wore his usual gray cashmere and carried himself like a man who had spent decades standing before skeptical lecture halls. But this time, the classroom had only one student, and she was sweeping under the radiator. Maria looked up when he entered. Her hair was tied back with a string, her hands still dusted with floor polish. "Sit," Julian said, gesturing to the armchair across from him. Class begins now. She blinked. But I haven't. You've read half of my cardiovascular notes, memorized 2 surgical pathways, and you drew the heart with correct anterior placement of the great vessels. That is more than what half of my med school applicants can do. She sat, cautiously. Julian placed a textbook between them. Human Cardiovascular Anatomy, 6th edition. Tonight, he said, we begin with the real foundation. Hemodynamics. Blood flow, pressure, resistance. Not just what happens, but why it happens. He drew a simple diagram on scrap paper. Q equals delta P over R. Flow equals pressure gradient over resistance. Understand this, he said, and you can predict any vascular response from a cut in the finger to aortic dissection. Maria leaned forward, brow furrowed. Q is flow, she whispered. So if resistance rises, flow drops unless pressure compensates. Good. Now, where do we see this matter in real life? She paused. In congestive heart failure. Julian looked up. Go on. Maria took the pencil and started sketching. When the left ventricle can't pump properly, pressure backs up into the lungs. That raises resistance in the pulmonary circuit, which reduces oxygen exchange, and then the heart tries to beat harder until it fails. Julian exhaled, long and low. Exactly. She grinned just slightly. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. They continued for 2 hours. Maria asked about the Frank Starling law. Julian explained with a rubber band and a grapefruit. She asked why arteries pulsate, but veins don't. He pulled out a rubber glove, filled it with water, and demonstrated compliance. The mansion outside was quiet. The world beyond didn't know that inside this silent, book-scented room, a mind was catching fire. At 9 p.m., Julian handed Maria a folded sheet. What's this? She asked. Your first test. She unfolded it. Why must the Reynolds number stay below 2,000 in coronary bypass grafts? Her eyes widened. That's fluid dynamics. Precisely. You've read the books. Now show me if you understand. Maria bit her lip and scribbled in silence. 10 minutes passed. Then she looked up. If the Reynolds number exceeds 2,000, flow becomes turbulent. In small vessels like coronaries, turbulence increases wall stress, promoting intimal hyperplasia leading to graft failure. That's why surgeons choose smoother, non-tapered grafts and antithrombotic linings. Julian stared at her. He had taught that same concept to Ivy League students for 20 years. None had said it better. But just as he was about to speak, Maria's hand trembled. She leaned forward. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't eat today. And then, quietly, she fainted. Julian caught her before she hit the floor. He laid her on the couch, covered her with his coat, and stood there for a long moment. Staring down at the sleeping girl, this housemaid with a surgeon's mind and a hunger she never once spoke aloud. The next morning, when Maria awoke, she found a sealed envelope beside her books. Inside, a prepaid card for meals, a hospital ID badge with her name on it, Maria Alvarez, research observer, and a handwritten note. You won't be cleaning anymore. You'll be learning JB. Outside, the sun was rising. Inside, a classroom of 2 had just become something more. Julian had prepared her all week. Every evening they studied in the library. Valves, chambers, pressure gradients, the physics of blood moving through tubes. He quizzed her relentlessly, never once softening his tone. And each time, Maria surprised him. She missed meals, but never missed an answer. On Saturday morning, Julian appeared at the kitchen door holding a navy wool coat. It was too large for her, but he insisted she wear it. Where are we going? Maria asked, still clutching her rag and bucket. To a place you have never been, he replied. The only place that can truly measure what you are. They rode in silence through the streets of Cambridge until the red brick towers of Harvard came into view. Maria pressed her hands into her lap, trying to still their shaking. "Harvard," she whispered. Julian glanced at her. "Have you ever stepped inside a lecture hall? Numb. I have only seen pictures online, Gimpe. Today, you will see more than pictures." The lecture hall smelled faintly of chalk dust and oak polish. The seats rose steeply, circling the wide wooden stage where the professor's desk sat like a throne. Students filled the rows, the air buzzing with conversations about exams, rotations, and weekend plans. Maria sat in the back, clutching her notebook so tightly her knuckles whitened. The wool coat Julian had given her was warm, but she felt cold all over. Some students turned and glanced at her. A girl with hair pinned neatly whispered, "Who is she?" "She is not in our section." Another boy smirked. Maybe a janitor wandered in. Maria dropped her gaze to the floor. Julian leaned closer. "Do not mind them. Remember what we practiced. Knowledge does not know uniforms." The professor entered. Tall, silver-haired, his confidence filled the room before his voice did. "Good morning. Today we continue our series on valvular heart disease. Let us begin with the tricuspid valve." He turned to the chalkboard and began to draw. His hand was steady, his voice polished, the kind of voice that carried authority. Students typed quickly, nodding. Maria squinted at the drawing. Something was wrong. The shape was familiar. Too familiar. 2 leaflets, not 3. Her pulse quickened. Julian saw her grip her pencil tighter. "What is it?" he whispered. She hesitated, then answered under her breath, "That is not the tricuspid valve." "It is the mitral." Julian's brows lifted. He said nothing. The professor continued, his chalk squeaking across the board. "The regurgitation pattern here is typical for tricuspid insufficiency. Observe." Maria's heart pounded. Her throat tightened. Every instinct screamed to stay silent. She did not belong here. She was nobody, a maid in a borrowed coat. But then she thought of her brother in the ICU bed, breath shallow, chest rising against failing lungs. She thought of nights spent alone with old textbooks, tracing diagrams by candlelight. If she stayed quiet, she was not only betraying knowledge, she was betraying him. Her hand rose slowly, trembling. The professor turned, eyebrows arched. "Yes, young lady." All eyes swung to her. She wanted to disappear, but she forced the words out. "Sir, that is the mitral valve. 2 cusps, anterior and posterior. The tricuspid has 3. If you follow the regurgitation flow you drew, it would not be possible for the tricuspid." Silence. Some students snickered. One boy muttered, "Who even is she?" A cleaning girl pretending to be a doctor. The professor's face stiffened. He strode to the board, examined the chalk lines. His hand froze. He erased the drawing without a word, then turned back. "Correct," he said curtly. "Thank you." Maria lowered her hand. Her cheeks burned. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. After class, the whispers began. "Did you hear her?" She corrected Dr. Walsh. "She is not even a student. Maybe she memorized a textbook." Maria hugged her notebook to her chest and hurried toward the door. Julian stopped at the threshold. His voice carried, deep and calm. "That girl, as you call her, has just corrected a Harvard professor in front of all of you. Do not forget it." The hall fell silent. Students shifted uneasily. The professor avoided his gaze. Maria tugged at Julian's sleeve once they were outside. "You should not have done that." Julian looked at her, eyes sharp but not unkind. "You should not have been able to do that. Yet you did." She pressed the notebook tighter. The crisp autumn air smelled of leaves and stone. For the first time, she felt something stirring inside her, something she had not dared to name. It was not pride. It was possibility. The stone walls of that golden hall had heard her voice. And though it trembled, it had not broken. for days after the lecture at Harvard. Maria carried a strange heaviness inside her chest. She had spoken, she had been right, but the memory of the students' laughter clung to her like smoke. Each night she returned to Julian's library, and each night he pressed her further, harder. "You cannot just know the names," he told her one evening, his voice low but firm. "You must see the patterns, the forces behind the names. Medicine is not memory, it is reason." He handed her a problem written on a sheet of graph paper. "Design a suture material that dissolves inside the heart without tearing under contraction." Maria stared at the words. Her mind reeled. Such a thing did not exist. She remembered her brother's scar after his last surgery, the stitches red and angry. "Is this real?" she asked. "It is the question many of us fail to answer," Julian replied. "Surgeons have tried absorbable sutures, but the tissue forces in a beating heart rip them apart before healing can complete. I gave this problem to students for 20 years. None of them solved it." Maria held the paper like it was alive. For the first time, she wondered if he was testing her faith rather than her skill. She whispered, "You think I cannot?" "I think you should try," Julian answered, his eyes unreadable. That night she did not sleep. She cut strips from old cloth, sewing them into rubber balloons to mimic chambers. She filled them with water, squeezed them until the stitches broke. Again and again. Her fingers blistered, the cloth tore, and still she worked. In the silence of dawn, she noticed something. When she overlapped the stitches, not in straight lines, but in tiny spirals, the pressure distributed more evenly. The balloon held longer. By noon, her table was covered in fabric hearts, thread hanging like veins. Her hands shook as she drew diagrams. Spiral sutures. Layered tension. She was no engineer, but she could see it. That evening, she placed the sketches before Julian. "The tissue contracts," she explained, pulling in multiple directions. "Straight sutures fail because they take the force all at once. But if we spiral the stitch, each thread absorbs part of the stress. It is like twisting many ropes together." Julian leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the paper. For a long moment he did not speak. Then his hand trembled as he touched the page. "You saw it," he whispered. 20 years, and you saw it in one night." Maria hesitated. Her voice was quiet. "Did I do well?" Julian closed the notebook. His face, usually carved from stone, softened. He did not answer her question directly. Instead, he turned away, pacing to the window. Outside, the Charles River glimmered in the late light. At last, he said, "You should not have been the one to see this. It should have been my students, my colleagues, but it was you." Maria felt a sting, as if the praise was also a wound. The following day, Julian was distant. He asked fewer questions, spoke less. Maria noticed the silence but did not understand it. She thought perhaps she had disappointed him. Then, one evening, as she entered the library, she overheard his voice from the study next door. "No," he said sharply into the phone. "She is not a student. She is a maid. She should not even be here." Maria froze, her heart stopping. The voice on the other end was muffled. Julian replied again, lower this time. "Yes, I know what she has done, but it is impossible." "Do you think the board would accept her? Without a diploma? Without credentials? She is nothing more than a story." Maria stepped back, her hands shaking. The paper she carried slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. At that sound, Julian turned. Their eyes met across the threshold. Maria's face burned with shame. She bent quickly, snatched the paper, and fled the hall without a word. That night she did not return to the library. She sat by her brother's bedside in the cramped apartment, tracing the stitches on his chest with trembling fingers. He stirred awake. "Why are you crying, Maria?" She wiped her eyes. "I am not." Go back to sleep. But her chest ached. The man who had opened the door to knowledge, the man who had called her student, had in the same breath called her nothing more than a maid. The first fracture had appeared, and though invisible, it was deep. Winter settled over Boston, and with it came the chill that no fireplace could fight. Maria worked longer hours than ever, but not in the mansion. She now divided her nights between Julian's library and the hospital where her brother was kept under observation. Each morning she left with heavy eyes, her notebook filled with sketches of hearts and blood vessels, and her spirit carrying a quiet dread. Her brother, little Daniel, was only 12. Thin as a shadow, he often lay curled under the stiff hospital blanket, his lips tinged blue. Maria sat beside him whenever she could, tracing the rhythm of the heart monitor with her finger. Each spike of the green line was both a comfort and a threat. She knew what the doctors had said. Without a transplant, the boy's heart would fail. The waiting list was too long. Time was too short. One evening, as she sat reading a textbook aloud to Daniel, he looked at her with a tired smile. "You sound like a doctor already." "I am only your sister," Maria whispered. "That is better than a doctor," Daniel said, and closed his eyes. Julian appeared at the hospital late one night. He wore his dark overcoat, his hair damp from snow, and carried a leather folder. Maria stood quickly when she saw him. "Why are you here?" she asked. "To see what is truly at stake," he replied. He studied the boy, the frail chest rising and falling against the monitors. Then he opened his folder and showed Maria a sheaf of printed research. "This is an experimental protocol," he said. "Stanford has been testing a new approach to myocardial grafting. Instead of waiting for a full heart transplant, they seed living cells onto a scaffold and reinforce it with the patient's own tissue." Maria's eyes widened. "You mean a partial graft, a patch that could replace the failing muscle?" "Exactly. It is still trial work, not yet approved. But I know the lead surgeon." Maria's hands shook as she reached for the pages. The diagrams were complex, layers of tissue drawn like topographic maps. Her eyes flew across them. She could see the possibility. For the first time, hope lit inside her like fire. "Can Daniel qualify?" she asked. Julian hesitated. "Not by ordinary means. The program is limited, and he does not meet the strict criteria. But I can speak for him." Maria's breath caught. "You would do that?" Julian nodded slowly. "Because you saw what none of my students saw. Because you remind me of what medicine should be." 2 weeks later, Daniel was flown west. Maria sat beside him on the plane, clutching his small hand. Julian accompanied them, working quietly on his notes as the city lights faded below. At Stanford, the hospital was brighter, more modern, with clean glass walls and the constant smell of antiseptic. The surgeons spoke quickly, their words filled with technical precision. Maria listened, absorbing everything. She asked questions, and to their surprise, her questions were not naive. "How do you ensure vascularization of the graft?" she asked one doctor. "We use a combination of angiogenic factors and microsutures," he explained, glancing at her with new respect. She nodded, scribbling. Each answer fed her hunger to understand. Julian watched silently, pride hidden in his eyes. The night before surgery, Maria sat with Daniel in the pediatric ward. The boy was pale, but his eyes were calm. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little. But if you are with me, I am not afraid." She held his hand tightly. "If this works, you will run again. You will play soccer. You will grow taller than me." He laughed weakly. "Taller than you is not very hard." Maria smiled through tears. At dawn, the doctors wheeled him into the operating room. Maria stood in the hallway with Julian, staring at the double doors. Her stomach churned. She whispered, "What if the graft fails?" What if the blood does not flow? Julian placed a hand on her shoulder. Do you remember the Reynolds number? We spoke of laminar flow, the quiet river inside the vessel. That is what the surgeons must achieve. Smooth flow, no turbulence. If they succeed, the graft will live. Maria closed her eyes and repeated his words like a prayer. Smooth flow, no turbulence. Hours passed. The corridor filled with the smell of coffee and the echoes of hurried steps. Maria sat with her head in her hands, her notebook open on her knees, filled with equations she could not bear to read. At last, the doors opened. A surgeon approached, mask pulled down, his face weary but calm. "It went well," he said. "The graft is in place. Blood is flowing. Now we wait." Maria broke into sobs, covering her face with both hands. Julian stood behind her, silent, his eyes wet, though he did not show it. That night, Maria crept into the ICU, where Daniel lay pale but breathing steadily. The monitors hummed their steady rhythm. She sat beside him, whispering into the dark. "You will live, Daniel. You will live." Julian watched from the doorway. For the first time in many years, he felt a strange warmth stirring in his chest, something he had almost forgotten. Hope Daniel survived the surgery, but the days that followed were heavy with silence. The boy lay in the intensive care unit, his chest rising and falling under white bandages, each breath assisted by the quiet rhythm of machines. Maria sat by the window, her notebook open, her pencil shaking in her hand. Every morning, a team of doctors and nurses entered, speaking in clipped tones about oxygen saturation, arterial blood gases, and ejection fraction. Maria listened carefully. Though she understood only half at first, she wrote everything down. At night, she sat in the dormitory for visiting families, going over the terms until they made sense. One evening, Julian found her hunched over the notebook. Equations covered the page. "What are you doing?" he asked. "They measure his circulation every hour," she whispered. "I thought if I could model it, I would know if he is getting better." She pointed to a formula. dV over dt equals chin minus quout change in volume over time equals inflow minus outflow. Julian leaned closer. "A simple balance equation," he said. "But for a heart, inflow and outflow are never steady. The ventricle contracts, the valves open and close. It is not a faucet. It is a rhythm." Maria nodded. "That is why I tried to use Euler's method." She showed him another page where she had drawn time steps like stairs. "If I break each second into smaller parts, I can follow how the pressure changes." Julian stared at the page. She was using numerical integration, something third-year engineering students struggled with, yet she explained it with pencil lines and patience. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "From your old notes, and from trying until it made sense." The next morning, the Stanford team met with Julian. The lead surgeon spoke with careful words. "The graft looks stable, but the boy's pulmonary pressure is higher than we expected. We need to know if the circulation is adapting." Julian gestured toward Maria. "Show them." Maria hesitated, then opened her notebook. She explained her model, pointing at the pressure curves she had sketched. She showed how if resistance in the lungs remained high, flow to the left ventricle would fall, leading to oxygen drop. But if medication could reduce that resistance by even 20%, the flow would stabilize. The doctors exchanged glances. One of them asked, "And where did you learn to calculate this?" Maria's cheeks flushed. "I just listened, and I watched." The lead surgeon looked at Julian, then at her, and finally said, "It is a good model. We will try the medication." That night, Maria sat at Daniel's bedside as the new drug entered his IV. Slowly, almost too slowly to notice, the monitor lines shifted. His oxygen rose, his breathing eased. She held his hand and whispered, "The equation was right. You are finding your rhythm again." Julian stood at the door, his face half in shadow. For years he had buried himself in money, in the safety of numbers. But watching the girl, hunched beside her brother, making sense of blood flow with nothing but a pencil, he felt the old fire return. The fire of discovery, the fire of healing. Weeks passed. Maria no longer spent her nights in the mansion's library. Instead, she haunted the hospital halls, shadowing nurses, listening to rounds, filling notebook after notebook. The doctors began to greet her with nods. Some even asked her opinion. One evening, a young resident approached her. "You are not a student here, are you?" Maria shook her head. "Then why do you know more physiology than half my class?" She only smiled faintly and said, "Because my brother needs me too." Daniel's condition improved. He began to sit up, to smile, to joke again. Maria helped him walk down the corridor, each step slow but steady. She counted his pulse as they moved, whispering numbers like prayers. Julian watched them from afar, his hands clasped behind his back. He knew what was coming. She was no longer his maid. She was no longer even just his student. She was becoming something greater, and soon the world would see. But he also knew the world would not welcome her easily. That night, as they walked together back to the dormitory, Julian asked, "Maria, have you thought about what you will do when Daniel is well?" She paused. "I only thought about keeping him alive, and after that—" She looked at him, her eyes dark but steady. "Then I will learn more, as much as I can. I want to understand every heartbeat, every vessel, not just for him, but for anyone who needs it." Julian nodded slowly. The cold night air carried their breath like smoke. "Then you must be ready," he said. "Because knowledge is a gift, but it is also a burden. The world will test you harder than I ever have." Maria tightened her coat and looked back at the hospital where her brother slept. For the first time, she did not feel small. For the first time, she felt the weight of a destiny pressing on her shoulders. Spring arrived in California, but warmth did not reach Maria's heart. Daniel was stronger, walking again, even laughing. Yet Maria felt a storm forming, one she could not name. It came not from the hospital, but from the outside world. One afternoon, as she left the pediatric ward carrying her notebook, she noticed a man with a camera near the elevators. He lowered his lens when their eyes met. A chill ran through her. That evening, a headline appeared on a local medical blog. "The Cinderella of Cardiology, Janitor Turned Prodigy at Stanford." The article described her in mocking tones. It told of a maid discovered in a Boston mansion, secretly studying stolen textbooks. It called her story charming but unbelievable. Some comments called it inspiring. Others called it fraud. Maria read the words in silence, her face pale. She had never asked for this. She only wanted to learn, to keep her brother alive. But now strangers were deciding whether she deserved even to hold a pencil. The next day at the hospital, whispers followed her. Nurses smiled kindly, but residents watched with suspicion. One of them muttered, "She is just pretending." Another said, "If she really belongs here, but why is she not in medical school?" Julian met her in the cafeteria. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed. "You have been seen," he said. "They will not let you study quietly anymore." "I never wanted this," Maria whispered. "I only wanted knowledge." "That is exactly why they fear you," Julian replied. "Because you did not ask their permission first." Soon the scandal spread. Larger papers picked it up. Harvard professor sponsors Maid in medical experiment. Some articles painted Julian as reckless. even dangerous. Others hinted at exploitation. Maria's name was dragged into arguments she could not control. Online forums debated whether she had truly solved the suture problem or whether Julian had fed her the answer. The board of Harvard summoned Julian back to Boston. In a long mahogany room filled with portraits of old scholars, they questioned him. Why did you allow an untrained girl access to restricted material one dean demanded? Because she earned it, Julian replied. Without credentials, without even a diploma, another pressed. Julian's voice grew hard. She corrected one of your own professors in open lecture. She built a working model of hemodynamics with nothing but pencil and paper. She is what a student should be. The board exchanged glances. One finally said, talent is not the issue. Order is. If we accept one maid, tomorrow we face chaos. Harvard is not a charity. Julian felt heat rise in his chest. Then perhaps I no longer belong to Harvard. He stood, removed the insignia pin from his lapel, and placed it on the table. That evening, Maria found him outside, sitting on the steps of the old hall. What happened? She asked. I resigned, Julian said simply. Her heart sank. Because of me. Because of truth, he corrected. But truth has a cost. Maria sat beside him in silence. Around them, the campus glowed with golden lamps. Students passed by, laughing, carrying laptops and books. For the first time, Maria did not envy them. She pitied them. They carried permission. She carried fire. That night, she returned to the hospital to watch Daniel sleep. She whispered to him, I do not know where I belong. His small voice answered through the darkness. You belong wherever people need hearts healed. Maria closed her eyes. The storm outside was growing. She could hear it in the whispers, see it in the headlines. But in her brother's quiet words, she found her anchor. She knew the road ahead would be harder than any exam. The world was watching now, and the world was not kind. The scandal did not fade quickly. For weeks, newspapers repeated the same phrases, the same doubt. Janitor, maid, prodigy, fraud. Maria tried to ignore them, but the words clung to her skin like soot. She walked the hospital halls with lowered eyes, afraid of catching another whisper. Daniel was recovering well. His cheeks grew less pale, his voice stronger. He sometimes asked her to read to him, not from fairy tales, but from her notebooks. He liked the way she spoke about arteries and valves, as if each word was a story in itself. One night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Maria took a long walk through the old part of Boston. Snow had melted into gray puddles along the cobblestones. She found herself before the door of a tiny apartment she had not visited in years. It was the place where her mother had once lived. Inside, dust covered the furniture, but on the table still lay a box of paper. Maria opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters her mother had begun but never finished. Some were addressed to Maria, others to no one at all. One read, My little girl, I hope one day you will not be afraid to learn, even if the world tells you not to. Maria pressed the paper to her chest. Tears blurred her vision. She whispered, Mama, they laugh at me. They call me a maid pretending. But the words on the page felt like an answer. Do not be afraid to learn. When she returned to the mansion, she found Julian sitting in the library, a bottle of brandy unopened on the desk. He looked older than she had ever seen him. They will not forgive me, he said. Not the board, not my colleagues. You gave them the truth, Maria replied. Yes, and they turned their faces from it. He sighed. Perhaps I am tired of fighting. Maria sat across from him. Her voice was quiet but firm. You once told me knowledge is a gift but also a burden. Maybe it is not ours to keep. Maybe it is meant to be given away. Julian looked at her for a long time. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Each one bore a different seal: Yale, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, even small colleges far from the city. I have written letters, he said. Not to the boards, not to the deans, to the teachers, to the ones who still remember why they began. If even one opens their door to you, you will continue. Maria touched the stack of envelopes, her hand trembling. Why would they listen? Because they know me, Julian said simply. And they will know you. That night, Maria sat by candlelight, reading her mother's unfinished letters and staring at Julian's envelopes. She took out her own sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Sir, I am Maria Alvarez. I have no diploma. I have no degree. But I have a brother who lived because I learned. If you give me a chance, I will not waste it. She paused, her eyes filled with tears. She folded the page, though she did not know whom it was for. Perhaps it was not meant to be sent at all. It was a letter to herself, a promise. In the quiet that followed, Maria felt something shift inside. The laughter of strangers no longer mattered as much. The world had tried to deny her, but her mother's words and Julian's belief had already given her permission. Permission to keep learning. Permission to keep fighting. The letters sat ready on the desk, waiting for the morning. Weeks passed. Letters had been sent, but no answers came. Maria tried not to hope, yet each day she checked the mailbox outside the mansion. Silence. Daniel continued to heal. He walked farther, climbed a few stairs, even laughed with the nurses. That joy sustained Maria, but when she returned to the empty library, she felt the absence of a future pressing on her shoulders. One cold evening, as she sat over her mother's unfinished letters, Julian entered quietly. In his hand was an envelope stamped with a green crest. It is from Vermont, he said, a small medical college. They read my letter, and they want to meet you. Maria's breath caught. Me? Yes. They cannot promise everything, but they are willing to open their doors. She pressed the paper to her chest. For the first time, the silence around her felt less heavy. The train to Vermont left near midnight. Maria carried only a small bag, her notebooks, and her mother's letters. Julian accompanied her, though his cough had grown harsher in recent weeks. He said nothing of it, but Maria noticed. The train rumbled through the dark countryside. Snow drifted past the windows, catching the moonlight. Maria sat awake, her heart beating faster with every mile. Julian broke the silence. Do you know what you will say when they ask who you are? Maria thought for a long time. Then she answered, I will tell them the truth, that I am a maid who learned because she had to. That I want to understand hearts because one heart is my brother's. Julian nodded. That will be enough. The college was small, its lecture hall plain compared to Harvard's marble and oak. The dean, a woman with kind eyes, welcomed Maria without ceremony. We have read Professor Beckett's letter, she said. We cannot ignore his words. But more than that, we believe in giving chances. Will you sit in on a class today? Maria nodded, her hands trembling. She entered the room. The students stared at her, whispering. Some smiled, others frowned. Maria felt the weight of every gaze, but she opened her notebook and waited. The lecture began on cardiac physiology. The professor asked a question about ventricular compliance. Silence filled the room. No one raised a hand. Maria's heart pounded. Then slowly, she lifted her hand. Sir, she said softly, compliance is the change in volume over the change in pressure. In a failing heart, compliance is reduced. So small changes in pressure cause big changes in volume. That is why the ventricle stiffens. The professor smiled. Correct. The students turned to look at her, some with surprise, some with doubt. But for the first time, Maria did not lower her eyes. After class, the dean approached her. "You belong here," she said. "Perhaps not in the usual way, but you belong." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. She thought of her mother's unfinished letter, of Julian's envelopes, of Daniel's smile. She whispered, "Thank you." Weeks became months. Maria studied harder than she ever had. She learned in 3 years what others learned in 7. She slept little, ate little, but her mind burned with hunger. The students who once doubted her began to ask her for help. Slowly, the whispers changed from suspicion to respect. Daniel often visited, walking through the small Vermont town with his sister. He told anyone who asked, "That is my sister. She saved me." Maria would smile, embarrassed but proud. At her graduation, she stood at the podium of the small hall. The air was filled with the scent of spring flowers. She looked at her classmates, at the professors, and finally at Julian sitting in the front row, coughing softly into a handkerchief. Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke. "I am here because I was given a chance. Not because I had a diploma, not because I had wealth, but because someone believed knowledge should be free to anyone willing to work for it. I will spend the rest of my life giving that chance to others." The hall erupted in applause. Julian's eyes glistened. For him, it was not just her victory. It was redemption. That evening, Maria walked back through the quiet Vermont streets. She looked up at the sky, scattered with stars, and thought of her mother. She whispered into the night, "Mama, I am learning still." In the silence, she felt an answer, a warmth, like a hand on her shoulder. The midnight train had brought her not just to a new place, but to the beginning of her true calling. Years passed. Vermont remained quiet, its hills green in spring and white in winter. Maria stayed, though she could have gone anywhere. Hospitals in Boston and San Francisco wrote letters of invitation. Research labs called. But she chose to remain in the little town where children carried notebooks too large for their hands, where farm boys came after chores to learn about anatomy, where daughters of waitresses asked shyly to study science. She rented a small building near the railway and turned it into a classroom. The walls were lined with second-hand books. The chalkboard was cracked, the desks mismatched, but every evening the room filled with eager eyes. Maria taught them what she once had to steal from dusty pages. She taught not just equations and diagrams, but also patience, humility, and the courage to ask questions. One afternoon, she heard the door creak. Julian Beckett stood in the doorway. He was older now, shoulders bent, his once strong voice softened by time. Maria hurried to him, guiding him inside. "You should not be traveling," she said. "I wanted to see what became of you," Julian replied, lowering himself into a chair. Maria placed in his lap a book she had written. The cover was plain, but the title was clear. Notes from a Maid Who Learned. Inside were her sketches, her models, her lessons written in simple words so that even a child could follow the path of blood through a heart. Julian traced the title with his fingers. "And you give this away freely to anyone who asks," Maria said. "Knowledge belongs to no one. It must pass on." Julian smiled faintly. "That is what I once forgot." She took his hand, frail now, the skin thin as paper. "You never forgot," she said. "You only needed someone to remind you." At the small graduation of her village students, Maria invited Julian to speak. He stood slowly, leaning on a cane, his voice carrying through the little room. I once taught in great halls, he said, before portraits and chandeliers. But the truest lecture is here, in this small place, because the heart of learning is not power, not reputation. It is hunger, and the gift of passing that hunger on. He paused, his breath shallow. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a watch, its silver case worn with years. This, he said to Maria, was the watch I wore when I defended my own dissertation. It has kept time through every lecture, every failure, every discovery. It is yours now. Maria shook her head. I cannot take it. You must, Julian said firmly, because time is the only thing we cannot keep. We can only give it away. His hand trembled as he placed the watch in hers. Their eyes met, teacher and student, maid and professor, and in that moment both knew the circle was complete. That night, Maria sat by the window of her small classroom. The lamplight flickered on the watch in her hand. Outside, children's voices echoed faintly in the street. She whispered, "Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Mama. Thank you, Daniel." In the quiet, she felt the warmth of all their hands upon hers. The fire of knowledge did not belong to her alone. It was a fire meant to be passed from one heart to another, like breath itself. And so the maid who once sat alone in a cold library at 3 in the morning had become a teacher, her life itself a living answer to the question she once whispered, "Do I belong?" The answer now was clear. Yes. Forever, yes. To those who have ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy of learning, this story is for you. May you remember that knowledge has no walls, only doors waiting to be opened, and may the fire you carry be passed gently to the next hand.